One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and is the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy, and we are right at the end of the year 2023. We only have a few days left. And today is part 7 of our mini-series on longevity and health span. And we'll be talking about boosting your VO2 max with Zone 2 training. And I guess this kind of all fits in with the tenor of the time of year, right? The New Year's right around the corner, New Year's resolutions, and everyone's thinking about how can I do better in 2024 than 2023. Well, honestly, I think everything that we've talked about in the last several months, from the hierarchy of the foundation of health to this whole discussion about longevity and health span, it's all part of that conversation, and it should be part of your thought process. So over the last few episodes, we've talked about the importance of your body's ability to bring oxygen into your bloodstream, to deliver that oxygen to your cells, and then use that oxygen to make ATP, or what we call energy. Scientists often call ATP the currency of energy, and it is. But I'm going to propose that we think of ATP as the currency of life. Now, why do I say that? Well, at the macro level, at the biggest top level view, if you have an absolute lack of oxygen, as in you stop breathing, then of course you're going to die. And without ATP or energy in the muscle cells, your muscles stiffen and go into what we call rigor mortis. Also at that macro level, every aspect of your life and your ability to experience and interact with the world that you live in, the people around you, all of this is predicated on your cells being able to function as they were designed to function. And that requires energy. That requires ATP. And the most efficient way that your cells make ATP is to burn some kind of a fuel source in the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen. And in scientific terms, we call that oxidative phosphorylation. And it can run on glucose or carbohydrates. It can run on fats or ketones. And there are even some amino acids that we get from protein that can be used to make small amounts of our total energy. But for maximum efficiency and function, the most efficient way to make energy is to use oxygen to make it. Right now, shifting back to the most recent topic of this mini series on longevity, we talked about your VO2 max. That's the measure of the limit of oxygen that you can take up and use for this process called oxidative phosphorylation. And we often refer to this as someone's aerobic fitness or their aerobic capacity, because the word aerobic means with oxygen. And in a very real way, your limit in your capacity to oxygenate your cells and create energy is a limit on life. It's a limit on life, and it's a limit on health, both longevity as well as quality of life. And in that last episode, I proposed 4 key questions around this topic, and I answered the first 3 in that last episode. And they are, what is your VO2 max? We defined that. How do you know what your VO2 max is? And I gave you a couple of ways to test yourself. What should your VO2 max be based on your age and your gender? You can easily Google that and find resources. And finally today, and this is the 4th question that we didn't get to, is how do you get from where you are to where you should be? In other words, how do you train and improve your VO2 max? And that's going to take us a couple of different episodes to talk about, because I want to make sure that you have as much information as necessary to make good quality decisions about how you're going to be entering 2024. Now, like many topics in the world of health, wellness, and fitness, there's often robust debate about concepts like this. And I don't think that there will be many exercise physiologists or scientists, researchers, or even clinicians who would disagree that there's a downside to having low VO2 max capacity. They won't disagree about the value of increasing that. But where we do see a lot of debate is, how do we best increase it? What are the strategies? What's effective? What's efficient? So on one hand, we have the long, steady duration cardio advocates. And on the other hand, we have those who advocate high intensity interval training, or what's commonly called HIIT And I'll use these terms interchangeably as we go through the next couple of episodes. And then we have those that say that there's value to both. I tend to fall in the middle. I'm more of a centrist, if anything. So today we're going to talk about what zone 2 is. We're going to talk about high intensity interval training, HIIT, or you could also say zone 5 training. They'll kind of speak around the same ideas and concept. We're going to talk about how to do them. And we're going to look to the research to inform our decisions about choosing one or the other, or some mixture of both. But let's talk about first things first. Before we dive into the details, let's build a mental framework, a way to think about these things, which allows us to hang the details on that framework in a way that everything starts to make sense. One of the problems that you might find is that there's no universally accepted definition of what zone 2 is versus zone 5. Yeah, we might have some consensus, but there's no central authority that says zone 2 is this, zone 5 is this. So in an effort to make this as easy as possible, most experts offer a heart rate-based way of dividing exercise of different intensities into different training zones. Zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And the way they do this is they suggest that you start by calculating your theoretical maximum heart rate. And that's basically a way to do it without going into a physiology lab and actually pushing yourself to the max to see how high your heart rate can go. So we start by calculating your theoretical maximum heart rate, and then we apply a certain percentage of that to find your target heart rate or your training heart rate for a given zone. So the heart rate that you might use for zone 2 training is going to be different than you would use for zone 5 or some kind of high intensity interval training. And a simple Google search of zone 2 heart rate is going to show you many results that break exercise intensities down into either 5 or sometimes 6 training zones. And again, it's important to note that these training zones are simply a way for us to gauge exercise intensity and to understand the training effect or the adaptations that we can expect from whatever time we're investing. And these training zones they're not set in stone, and there's some disagreements about where one zone ends and another zone begins. And so this whole paradigm, this mental framework, is useful as a guide, but it's not a hard and fast rule. And when we get to the how part of this discussion, we're going to use zone 2 percentages based on heart rate as a starting point that we're going to need to refine, or you will need to refine, and you will need to individualize for yourself. Now, before I go any further, let me give you my CYA statement. Be smart. If you choose as you go into the new year to engage in exercise, make sure your body, your heart, your lungs, and everything is ready for that. Make sure that if you have any medical conditions that might prevent you from doing this, or orthopedic conditions that might prevent you from doing certain activities, check with your attending physician, whoever your primary care is, or a specialist if you have one, and just make sure that you're okay to do this. Be smart above all else. Okay, so I'm going to have this up on the screen for those of you who are watching this episode on YouTube. So here's an example of how the zones break down according to percentage of maximum heart rate. And remember that there's some disagreement about some of the numbers. For example, zone 1, which relates to very light activity or exercise. This would be like walking around the house doing chores, going outside for a leisurely stroll. Typically, this is, somewhere less than 50 or 60% of your maximum heart rate. So if your maximum heart rate is, say, 140 beats per minute, your heart rate would be at 70 or something like that. So it's really not much of an elevation of heart rate over just standard daily activities. And that kind of stuff is not really going to train your VO2 max. It's not going to improve things like your mitochondrial efficiency, but it's actually good for recovery from injury or from illness, or as rest intervals and as you recover from very intense exercise. So zone 1 is the least taxing, but also the one where you get the least benefit. Zone 1. Zone 2, which is going to be the topic of much of our discussion today, is light activity, generally characterized as light. And because it's a range, you could think of it as light to kind of low moderate. But generally, people say that zone 2 activity or exercise brings your heart rate up to somewhere between 60 to 70% of whatever your theoretical max heart rate is. And we'll talk about how to calculate that coming up here in a little bit. So 60 to 70%. But like I said, there's disagreement here. Some people set zone 2 limits at 55 to 65% of your max heart rate. Others might set it at 70 to 80% of your max heart rate. So there's kind of a bit of a range. Like zone 2 could be anywhere from 55 to 80% of whatever your theoretical max heart rate is. And that's a wide range. And so it's very difficult to say just in general, well, zone 2, you have to train at X% of your heart rate, and that's going to work for everyone. This is why we use heart rate as a beginning, and we have a methodology to be able to individualize that for you. And we're going to talk through all of that. But without a doubt, the better your VO2 max is, the higher the heart rate range has to be for you to be at what I call the sweet spot. And that will become clear in a little bit later. But this is why percentages, which might be good as averages of large groups of people, might not necessarily apply to one individual person, because these generalities and guidelines and averages and summaries can't possibly know what your individual circumstance is. Again, it's just a starting point. Beyond zone 2, we have zone 3, which is an increased demand from zone 2. It's a little bit harder. It's commonly called moderate activity or exercise. And this might be anywhere from 70 to 80% of your theoretical max heart rate. And this is the range where, for most people, you're going to start shifting away from burning fat as your primary fuel source to burning glucose and starting to create metabolic waste products that your body has to handle. So zone 3 is typically what we commonly call the inflection point, as we start to shift the dominance of which energy is contributing to that activity. Zone 4 is even harder. It might be considered hard activity, and this is 80 to 90% of your theoretical max heart rate. And then we have zone 5, which is much more intense and sometimes called vigorous or intense exercise. And that could range anywhere from 90 to 100%. Some people say 85 to 100%. And some people even go so far as to go beyond zone 5 and add a zone 6, saying that zone 5 might be 85 to 95% of your max heart rate. And zone 6 is the super high intensity stuff that you can't sustain for very long at all. And that's 95 to right at 100% of your max heart rate. And these, zone 5 and zone 6, especially the upper limit of zone 5, if you're using a 5-zone model, these include activities that you can only sustain for like 20 seconds or less. And that might be like literal max out sprinting. Like I'm literally running for my life and I'm putting everything I can into that. That doesn't last all that very long. So that's a general breakdown of zones 1 through 5 or 6 if you're using a 6-zone model. And to be honest, like when we use terms like zone 2 or zone 5, this is fairly modern terminology. And it's terminology, again, that we use to distinguish not just different cardio training categories, but also to indicate two pretty key things. And that is the type of muscle fibers that you're using for that activity and which energy systems are used in each one. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, but this is part of what you're getting out of zone 2 or zone 5 training. Personally, I like to know some of these details. It makes a difference to me because I like to know why I'm doing something, especially if I'm doing something that I don't particularly enjoy. I want to know that there's a payoff. I want to know that there's a benefit. So, for example, to give you a little bit more detail on this, we have 3 or 4 energy systems that fuel our activities. And we have 2 general muscle fiber types in our skeletal muscle. So let's talk about these 3 or 4 energy systems first. And I say 3 or 4 because some people combine the first 2. I'm going to use a 4 energy system model here. And, again, some people say 3 and they just simply combine the first 2 because they're so tightly related. And again, I'll pop this up on the screen for anybody who's watching on YouTube. We can look at these energy systems from several different perspectives. We can look at different energy systems and categorize them as to the rate and capacity at which they produce ATP or energy for us. We can also look at them through the lens or the perspective of the energy and time domains that they serve. So, for example, some of the energy systems are used only for very high energy but very low duration activities. These will not require a lot of speed, a lot of power. We can also connect these different energy systems to our 5 or 6 different training zones And we can look at the primary fuel source that's used, and we can talk about the metabolic waste products that are created from these different energy systems that the body has to somehow manage, or else there's going to be a limit on the activity that we have. So again, I'll put this up on the screen for people on YouTube. Let's talk about the very first of the 4 energy systems. And this is simply where whatever muscles you're using, let's say your lower body doing an elliptical or running on a treadmill, for example, the very first but the most limited source of energy is the ATP, or the energy that's already been created that's stored inside your muscles. And the stored ATP, again, you have a very limited supply of this, but you can create energy from it very quickly because it's already there, right? Remember, ATP is the currency of energy. So with stored ATP, we don't have to wait for the body to make it. It's right there. It's utilizable, but its production capacity is extremely low because we can only store so much inside each muscle. And the stored ATP basically serves very high, quick demand activities that typically last only 3 to 5 seconds, right? Think of this as the spark that gets things going, particularly if you're getting ready to do some kind of a high output, high energy, high intensity activity. And as it relates to the zones, this is like your upper limit of zone 5 and your zone 6 stuff. And again, primarily we're talking about energy stored in the form of ATP in the muscle that's already been created, just sitting there waiting for us to use it. And the good news about this is that the more muscle we have and the more we do these types of activities, the more ATP we can store. And think of it as a very clean burning system. There are really no metabolic waste products that have to be handled or cleared out from this energy system. But remember, it's like a quick burn, it's a flash, and then it's gone. But it does fuel very high intense, very short duration work. Now, closely related to that, and thus some people combine these two together, is what we call the phosphocreatine system. And if you have ever heard of or know someone, or you yourself have ever used creatine monohydrate, for example, as a nutritional supplement to support your exercise, and it's a very well-researched, in my opinion, worthy of consideration supplement to use, creatine monohydrate, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about providing substrate for this phosphocreatine system. And much like the energy that comes from stored ATP, it's very fast, but the potential to make ATP is very low, right? We can only make so much, and it takes time to regenerate. And so just like stored ATP, the energy that we get from the phosphocreatine system fuels very high intense activity, high speed activities, and it really only, because of limited supply, it really only lasts us for maybe 3 to about 20 seconds. It's going to vary slightly from person to person, but that's the average, about 3 to 20 seconds of activity. And this also will equate to the upper limits of like zone 5 or zone 6 training if you're using a 6-zone model. And much like stored ATP, there are metabolic byproducts that come from using both ATP as well as the phosphocreatine system. But there's essentially very little to no waste products. But we can't rely on this. We can't rely on this for sustained activity. And it's only used, again, for very, very short duration, very, very high intensity work. Now, it doesn't mean it's not important, but that's the characteristic. The third energy system is what we call the anaerobic system. And this is what we've been talking about predominantly in the past when we talked about burning glucose for fuel, particularly through this process called glycolysis. And to be honest, you can burn glucose or glycogen either anaerobically or aerobically, right? Aerobically, you convert glucose into pyruvate that goes into the mitochondria, where we use the oxidative phosphorylation Krebs cycle process to make energy from it. So glucose is actually a little bit flexible in that sense. But the anaerobic system, it's still kind of a high energy output, but it's not as high or as fast as stored ATP. It's not as high or as fast as the phosphocreatine system. So we start getting into slightly longer time domains and slightly lower power outputs or intensities, but it's still the power and output and time domain of our anaerobic system, which runs purely on glucose. That is still a moderate to high intensity and it lasts longer than the other two, but only up to a maximum of maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So anywhere from 30 seconds to about 120 seconds, you're burning predominantly glucose as your primary fuel source. And in our let's say in our 5-zone model, that equates roughly to somewhere in zone 3 to inclusive of zone 5. And again, the major fuel source is glucose and glycogen. But one of the downsides of the anaerobic system, and not to discourage you from doing this kind of work, but one of the drawbacks, if you will, is that the anaerobic system burning glucose through the process of glycolysis does create a metabolic product, a waste product, in the form of hydrogen ions that if we don't manage that, it will limit our capacity to do exercise. And so in some cases, and this might relate to you or someone that you know as an individual, some people try to do moderate to high intensity interval training and they just crash. They just can't do it. They can't sustain it even for, say, 120 seconds. And when they're done, they feel miserable and the recovery takes forever. And that might imply not the fact that they can't produce the energy for that system, but because they're not handling the waste products that come out as a result of that. And so energy metabolism kind of has two general sides to the equation. Number one is, can you produce it? Can you fuel the activity that requires it? And the second is, how do you manage the waste that comes out of that? And this is where we create some very significant waste products in the form of hydrogen ions that change the acidity of your cells and the tissues of the working muscles. And that acidity changes the activity of different enzymes involved in energy production, such that if you don't manage the waste products that comes from your glucose-based anaerobic metabolism, that energy system shuts off. And that's why there's a limit to it. That's why we can really only use this for about 120 seconds at a time. So that's the third system. The fourth system is the aerobic system. We've talked about this at length. This is where we're making energy in the mitochondria. We're doing it in the presence of oxygen. That's what aerobic means. The cool thing about this is that, we not only get to use glucose, as I mentioned before, right? If we can convert glucose into something called pyruvate, that can go through the aerobic metabolism system as well. But this is the only place that we can get to burn fat as a fuel source, whether that's dietary fat or whether that is fat from your body. So the primary fuel of your aerobic system is going to be some combination of glucose and fatty acids, and the relative proportion is going to depend on the intensity of your work. The more intensity your work is within the aerobic system, the more that you run the risk of tipping over and really demanding that your system uses glucose instead of fatty acids. But I get ahead of myself just a little bit. So the aerobic system, which is mitochondrial, aerobic meaning it is using oxygen, that's what we call oxidative phosphorylation. This is an energy system that takes time to create ATP. The trade-off is, even though we can create a tremendous amount of ATP through the aerobic system, through this oxidative phosphorylation, it takes time to do it, which is why the system doesn't work for really high intensity, really short duration. It's just not fast enough to produce the fuel to engage in those activities. So we have to have an alternate way of doing it. So the intensity is low to, say, moderate. And the time domain for the aerobic system is pretty much anything that you can sustain for more than 3 minutes at a time. So it could be an hour, it could be 45 minutes, it could be an hour and a half, it could be 4 hours. That's your aerobic system. And this equates, of course, to zones 1, 2, and maybe the very beginning of zone 3, because in the beginning of zone 3, if you might remember from previous episodes, this is where we burn a mixture of fat and glucose, but we're relying less on fat and we have to use more glucose because the demand to fuel higher intensity exercise is increased. Therefore, we have to start using glucose as a fuel source. Now, again, there's a metabolic waste product that is produced as a result of this, and that is carbon dioxide. If you Google oxidative phosphorylation and you look at the chemical equations that basically illustrate how this system works, Yes, we get ATP as energy, but we also get water, which is not really a waste product, but we get that as a byproduct. And then we have CO2, and CO2 can change the chemistry of the body. And again, just like the hydrogen ions that come from burning glucose through anaerobic metabolism, we have to be able to buffer or utilize or convert CO2 into something else or get rid of it somehow, or else we're going to have a limit on our ability to actually continue to create the energy. And one of the key ways that we get rid of carbon dioxide is by converting it into something called bicarbonate. And that happens at the cellular level. Roughly about 70% of the CO2 that we generate as a result of aerobic metabolism gets converted to bicarbonate, which then, interestingly enough, is used to buffer things like hydrogen ions. And then any excess we can use red blood cells. We grab the CO2, we bring it back to our lungs, and we breathe it out in our breath, right? So oxygen comes in and we breathe out CO2. And that's kind of big picture view of how breathing and metabolism link together. So that's a very quick and dirty review of the 4 different energy systems. And why are we talking about this is because when you choose to exercise in zone 2 or zone 5 or zone 3 or whatever, you are asking your body to engage or produce energy through a very specific system. And so it's not enough, at least in my opinion, it's not enough to just simply go into the gym and hop on a treadmill or on a bike and just pedal without knowing what you're doing and what it's doing for you. And so if you choose to train in zone 2 versus zone 5, you're going to get very specific metabolic adaptations that are linked down all the way down to these energy systems. And they're linked to different muscle fiber types as well. So let's talk about 2 different types of skeletal muscle fibers. You have type 1 and type 2, and they serve different functions. And honestly, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, in that type 2 fibers are further subcategorized or subdivided as type 2A and 2B. You have type 1, you have type 2A, 2B, for example, but we're not going to go to that level of detail. For now, we're just going to stick with types 1 and type 2. In general, type 1 muscle fibers are your long-distance endurance fibers, and people often call them slow-twitch muscles. They use the aerobic system that's designed to fuel low-energy, long-duration activities, like going out for a 10-mile run or a marathon, for example. In contrast, type 2 muscle fibers, remember there's really 2 subtypes, but type 2 muscle fibers in general are your power and strength muscle fibers. We often call them fast twitch muscle fibers, and they use the higher power but shorter duration energy systems that use glucose and phosphocreatine and stored ATP to fuel that activity. Now, both are important, which is why everybody has a blend of these different muscle fiber types. And for the average person, the split between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers is about 50-50, and that's a rough estimate. And sometimes, sometimes you need to go slowly over a long period of time, a long distance. And sometimes we need to pick up the speed and we need to cover a short distance very quickly, or maybe we need to jump or climb something, or we need to lift something heavy. Each energy system and each type of muscle fiber plays a role, and the type of cardiorespiratory, and eventually we'll talk about resistance training. Each one of these training choices has implications for what types of muscle fibers you're using and what energy systems that you're using as well. So while the average person has this 50-50 split between slow and fast twitch muscle fibers, some people are born with a relative dominance of one over the other. And those people who have more slow twitch fibers than fast tend to gravitate towards the endurance sports because they're good at that, just naturally good at it, right? So there are people that, let's say in high school who just they ran cross country because they didn't have to train much for it. They were just good at it naturally. And there were others who were not. So things like long distance biking or running, people who are more slow twitch than fast twitch are going to gravitate towards that because it's easier for them to do. Now, they might struggle with the demands of activities or exercise that requires higher power on output and speed, so there's a trade-off. Other people might have more fast twitch muscles These are the type 2, and they will tend to naturally gravitate towards activities and sports that require speed and strength. They're going to be naturally better at sprinting or jumping or, to get fancy, Olympic weightlifting. But these people might struggle to do the lower power, longer duration activities like jogging a mile or two. And I'll just give you myself as an example. I played basketball and volleyball when I was in high school and college, and even after college. I competed in track and field, but my events were the 100-meter dash, the high jump, and the long jump. And so you can guess that I just naturally gravitated towards the high speed, high power, short duration events and activities. And while I could go play basketball or volleyball pretty much nonstop for a couple of hours, it was torture. If someone said, "Hey, let's go run a mile," I was torture. And I've never run a 3K or a 5K. I have no interest in it. I'm not good at it. And that tells me that these are things I should probably develop within myself. These are capacities that I'm lacking. And yeah, there's some genetics here, right? There's some genetics at play. But the interesting thing is that both fiber types can be trained, right? So if you're an average person with a 50-50 split between type 1 and type 2 fibers, you can bias your muscle fiber type over time with the right training. If you do more endurance training, then your muscles and energy systems will remodel to reflect that. And you will have more slow twitch muscle fibers than you had in the past. And you're going to improve your ability to do these or to use these slow burning energy systems that allow you to go long distances over longer periods of time. On the other hand, if you're an average person and you want to develop the capacity to generate speed and strength and power, you can train to create those adaptations, and your muscles and your energy systems will remodel over time to match that. Which is to say that your genetics are simply a starting point. They're a platform to begin with, and you get to choose how your body functions over time by training these different capacities. And it's important to note that nobody has 100% of one fiber type over another, right? It's all relative percentages. Elite marathoners have about 75% slow twitch fibers, but about 25% of their muscle fibers are still fast twitch. And most of that is the training effect rather than simply genetics. The genetics is their starting point. And if they did nothing but long distance running over time, they develop more of these type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers. And the same is true for things like elite weightlifters and sprinters. These people have about 75% fast twitch muscles, but they still have about 25% slow twitch muscles. For you and me, being non-competitive athletes and seeking health and wellness and longevity, we want sufficient capacity in both systems because both have value. But understand that if you're metabolically deranged, if you're sedentary and deconditioned, neither of your energy systems or your muscle fiber types are working the way that they should to serve your goals of health and wellness. They need to change. You need to improve them, and you need to improve both. Now, just so that you don't get the idea that I've drifted off the topic of cardiorespiratory training into things like resistance training because I've mentioned things like Olympic weightlifting or whatever, here's the link. Aerobic type cardio, what we sometimes call steady state cardio, now most people refer to this as zone 2 cardio, uses your slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers and trains your aerobic metabolism, the burning of glucose and fats in the presence of oxygen. But if you're controlling your heart rate and you're truly in zone 2, you're going to be burning more fat as your fuel in a relative percentage than you will be burning glucose. On the other hand, high intensity interval training like zone 5 training, whether that's, running sprints on a treadmill or doing a hard and fast 500-meter row and then taking a rest and then do it again. These use fast twitch muscle fibers, and they enhance your anaerobic energy systems and your ability to utilize glucose to provide that quicker, more powerful energy for that activity. So the fiber types are different, the energy systems that they use are different, and the adaptations that you create using either zone 2 or zone 5 They're different, but you need them both. And this means that the trade-off with using or developing only your fast twitch muscle fiber function is that while you generate more power and speed, which is good to be able to do, you fatigue more quickly. In contrast, if all you do is low and slow zone 2 work, you lose out on all the benefits of zone 5 work or high intensity interval training. And I'll put a plug in here for a later episode. We'll be talking about resistance training at some point. If all you're doing is cardio training and you're not ever lifting weights, you're losing out. If you're only lifting weights and you're not doing cardio, you are also losing out. We want a mixture of all of these different things to serve the goals that we have. So in general, you use your slow twitch muscle fibers for slow, low intensity work that lasts for a longer period of time. And you use your fast twitch muscles when you need higher power, faster speeds for shorter periods of time. Remember a few minutes ago when I told you that there are zone 2 advocates who argue with the zone 5 people and vice versa. Zone 2 advocates tend to believe that the best way to develop things like your VO2 max is to do the steady state cardio, that slow, steady, long work of zone 2 training. But, says the zone 5 high intensity interval training advocate, these people say, well, I can get the same benefit to my VO2 max by going harder and faster for shorter periods of time, which saves time. And who doesn't want to spend less time in the gym? That's a big part of their argument. And the problem with the argument is that zone 2 and zone 5 are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are complementary. They both can increase your VO2 max. They both can increase the number of mitochondria you have. They both can increase the formation of new blood vessels in your muscles and in your heart, which improves blood flow, and all of that is good. But they each have some unique advantages and disadvantages that you need to know about. And that is going to be the topic of the next episode in this series on longevity, health, and wellness, where we're talking about VO2 max, zone 2 and zone 5 training. I hope you guys have a great New Year's Eve, and I hope you're looking forward to doing more things, better things, and making a better you in the new year. So for now, Merry Christmas, if I haven't said that, Happy New Year, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Inflammation Nation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. You can use the links in the episode description to check out Dr. Noseworthy's self-learning programs for thyroid, detox, and gut health. Or you can submit a question for the podcast and even reach out to Dr. Noseworthy directly.